Hi everybody, welcome to week 11, and this week is our continuation of the discussion on the balanced scorecard. We're going to take a slightly different approach this week to the balanced scorecard. I have one more reading from Kaplan and Norton for you, and we're going to use the balanced scorecard this week to once again give you a chance to talk about your term project organization. So let's get right into that. So let's just kind of talk about where we've been at in this semester so far. And this is the same slide I showed last week, but it's important to reiterate some of these things. We have discussed John Bryson's 10-step model a lot. We talked about Mark Moore's strategic triangle, another way of looking at strategic planning. We've looked at some of Jen Lockman's videos on YouTube on strategic planning, which I think are very, very useful for you, especially if you are involved in strategic planning for a nonprofit organization. And then last week we did an overview of this thing called the balanced scorecard, which was introduced by Robert Kaplan and David Norton. And so this week, we're going to have one more week of talking about the balanced scorecard. And the discussion this week is going to relate it directly to your term project organization. Okay, so you've seen this slide before too, right? I do this every week. I'm sorry. Repetition is the way of learning things. But we do have these two more written assignments left, and they both revolve around your term project. So your term project outline coming up on the 21st of November, and then your final term project paper, finals week, December 16th. And we have 4 more discussions left counting this week. So really the semester really is coming rapidly to an end. But again, this week gives us an opportunity to talk about your organization one more time. And I do that really to get a lot of these concepts ingrained so that you can really talk about your organization in a very educated manner. So that's just a reminder. Let's get into more discussion about what we're doing this week. Okay, so the article that I've assigned you this week, I posted it on Blackboard. This is a 2007 article by Kaplan and Norton, and this is in addition to the article I gave you last week by Kaplan and Norton about the balanced scorecard. Well, this article this week really talks about how to use the balanced scorecard as a strategic management tool. In other words, the organization has a strategy that they want to implement and integrate throughout the organization. How can they use the balanced scorecard to do that? And so Kaplan and Norton suggest that there are 4 processes that leaders in the organization should use to use the balanced scorecard to integrate their strategy through the organization. And briefly, these processes are translating the vision, communicating and linking, business planning, and feedback and learning. Well, translating the vision, what they mean by that is they say that means building a consensus around the organization's vision and strategy. So you've probably been involved in organizations where the managers, the bosses, will show various charts and graphs to say, well, here's how we're doing with sales, or here's how we're doing in, achieving our mission. Oftentimes though, organizations don't do the best job of translating what that really means. I mean, you can say, here's what our sales are, but what's really the vision for sales? I mean, do we plan to grow sales by 1% this year? Do we plan to grow sales by 50% this year? And you, as the person doing the sales, that would be nice to know. So that's what they mean when they say translating the vision. They're trying to get consensus within the organization for that vision, for that strategy. That's closely related to communicating and linking. So what they mean by that is it's incumbent on managers to communicate the strategy up and down the organization. Remember last week I asked this question about how well leaders do in communicating an organization's strategy. We talked about I guess it was a couple weeks ago, the role of leadership in the strategic plan. And I think we had a lot of discussion on the discussion board that said, some bosses, some leaders are better than others at communicating strategy up and down the organization. And I think that's intuitive, and we've all been in organizations where it's not done so well. But my belief is that if you're a leader, if you're a manager in an organization, that's part of your job. It should almost go without saying, but unfortunately you do have to say it to leaders and managers sometimes, that is part of their job to communicate strategy up and down the organization. And then there's this issue of business planning. And so what do Norton and Kaplan mean by that? What they really mean is that plans should be integrated. You might have a plan, say you work in a nonprofit. You might say, we'd like to grow our endowment by 5% this year. We'd like to increase donations to it to grow that endowment by 5%. Okay, well, what does that link to in terms of the goals of the organization? What they're really trying to say is that goals should not stand in separate silos within the organization. They should relate. And then finally, feedback and learning. And again, we've talked about this, that strategic planning is really not just this top-down exercise. The people at the top have to be involved. The people at the top have to be champions of the process. But the people at the top are not going to necessarily get the feedback they need unless they build an environment where feedback is welcomed. And so this is what Kaplan and Norton are talking about, enabling strategic learning in the process. So if you read the article, you're going to see these next three diagrams. And what do these really mean? Well, okay, so this chart shows a typical balanced scorecard with these four perspectives, right? The financial perspective, the customer perspective, learning and growth perspective, and the internal business process perspective. But look right in the middle of that diagram. It says vision and strategy. So what Kaplan and Norton are saying here is that the vision and strategy of the organization is integrated throughout these four perspectives. In other words, learning and growth, when we're talking about training employees or training volunteers, for example, or growing employees or volunteers, we don't do that in a vacuum. That should be related to the mission, to the vision, to the strategy of the organization. So the vision and strategy should be integrated through these four perspectives. And then second, each of the four perspectives does not stand alone. They all relate to each other. And so often, we all have worked in organizations where we worry about our day-to-day job. And I think that came up in the discussion last week. Often, you're doing your job and you don't think about the larger vision and strategy. And part of that is really natural, right? Because you have to focus on your job. But it is really important for everyone in the organization to understand how they fit into the vision and strategy. You saw this chart within the article as well. Well, what is this talking about? This is those four processes that we talked about: translating the vision, communicating and linking, business planning, and feedback and learning. These are the jobs that leaders in the organization, managers, are supposed to be doing. So when they translate the vision, they're supposed to clarify the vision. When they communicate and link, they're supposed to be the ones helping to set goals and linking rewards and performance measures. When they come up with business planning, they're supposed to be aligning the initiatives with each other. They're supposed to be allocating resources. And then finally, in feedback and learning, they're supposed to be articulating the shared vision. And so the key takeaway here is that in the middle here we see the balanced scorecard. And the balanced scorecard is the vehicle that enables all these processes. And finally, according to Kaplan and Norton, these processes are sequential. And I'm not completely sold on that. I kind of think all these things should be going on at once. But what they're talking about is that it takes a a while to successfully integrate a balanced scorecard into an organization. So this is what I was just talking about. This is actually 12 months. That's the line across there are months, not weeks. This is actually 12 months of a 30-month process that they talk about in the article. So remember that word commitment we've talked about a few times. Bryson talks about this. Organizations beginning a strategic planning process as if strategic planning is some kind of magic wand, and you can wave strategic planning over an organization and it will instantly improve. And Bryson's, he says you shouldn't do that. And Kaplan and Norton here are saying you shouldn't do that. So what they're saying is, if you really want to successfully integrate, in this case, a balanced scorecard system and your strategic plan, it's going to take time and it's going to take commitment. So as you read the article, think about that, and think about your term project organization, and think about organizations that you've been involved with as well. So finally, this is what we're going to be doing this week on the discussion board. One more chance for you to share with the rest of the class your term project organization. And again, you should be getting very familiar with this organization by now, because a lot of you have already conducted the interview. You're working on your outline, and so you know really what you want to say about the organization. But I want you to use the balanced scorecard this week to talk about your organization. So maybe you've considered your organization from the perspective of the strategic triangle. Maybe you've considered your organization from the perspective of the SWOT exercise. And for example, quite a few of you are using the SWOT exercise with your organization. So you're using that tool to analyze your organization. Well, this week I want us to use Kaplan and Norton's balanced scorecard to consider your organization. And so what I'm going to have you do, and you can see these bullets here, is I'm going to have you in the discussion board create what I call a mini balanced scorecard. So it's a small balanced scorecard. It's not fully fleshed out. But what I want you to do is I want you to use the 4 perspectives of the balanced scorecard, and I want you to come up with statements that represent each of those perspectives. And so then I want you to provide an objective that supports that perspective. So what I'm telling you here is you don't have to be completely mathematically accurate. I mean, if you want to talk about the financial perspective, I wouldn't expect you to know every aspect of the organization's financials here. But I want you to propose perspectives that you think are useful for the organization. So once again, this is an exercise where I'm putting you in charge of the organization, and I'm saying, hey, look, here's my organization. If I use the balanced scorecard, how would I approach it? How would I approach the growth and learning perspective? How would I approach the customer or client perspective? How would I approach the internal business perspective? How would I approach, finally, the idea of the financial perspective? So for the discussion this week, I'm going to have you do that. Look more on the discussion board for the specifics. And once again, I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say about your organizations, this time using the balanced scorecard. And so my final pitch really on all this is again, every single, not every single week, but for several of our weeks, we've looked at these different approaches to strategic planning. And so what you ought to be taking away from this class in terms of that is there's all kinds of different ways to consider strategic planning. Strategic planning is important. The worst kind of strategic planning, as far as I'm concerned, that any organization can do is none at all. So I'm having you take this approach to look at your organization in the hopes that in the future you'll be able to apply it to a real life organization that you are working with. Thanks a lot.